1960 was not the beginning of broadcasting's fascination with politics. In 1920, on its first day on the air, America's first licensed radio station, KDKA Pittsburgh, broadcast Warren G. Harding's victory over presidential candidate James Cox.
It is now apparent that the Republican ticket of Harding and Coolidge is running well ahead of Cox and Roosevelt. At the present time, Harding has collected more than 16 million votes against some 9 million for the Democrats.
The audience? Fewer than 1,000 listeners. But by 1924, more than 500 stations were beaming staticky programs to 3 million Americans. All across the land, people gathered round the radio, as many called it then, to hear coverage of events like the marathon 17-day Democratic Convention. At first, politicians largely ignored radio, preferring to harangue voters in person than trust a box full of tubes and wires. It took Franklin D. Roosevelt to prove with his fireside chats that a politician with a microphone could mesmerize an entire nation.
We must nominate a liberal pair of candidates running on a liberal and forward-looking platform.
My time is your time.
As for television, it was only an inventor's toy in 1931 when singer Rudy Vallee submitted to one of TV's first, but not last, personality Puff interviews.
I've always been under the impression that gentlemen prefer blondes.
That may be so. Possibly the answer is that I'm not a gentleman.
In 1939, television was described at the New York World's Fair as the communications medium of tomorrow. By the early 50s, tomorrow was here, with TV sets pouring off assembly lines, and politicians realizing that a message voters could see was better than one they could only hear.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
No one benefited from television more than Ike. His mile, wide grin somehow made voters forget his tangled syntax, an early hint that maybe the medium would become more important than the message.
Beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
In 1952, with sets now in 4 million homes, national TV covered both conventions for the first time. And it also made a star of a former congressman from California who told a nationwide audience one September night that, yes, his family had accepted a campaign gift, a Cocker Spaniel named Checkers.
And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep him.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're going to rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on.
By 1956, television was giving America a look at another young politician, a wealthy U.S. senator from Boston, who wouldn't win his party's nomination for vice president, but would get the bug to be in the White House.
Massachusetts cast 41 votes for the next president of the United States, John F. Kennedy.
In 1960, he would get his chance, and the nation watched as John Kennedy crisscrossed the country, trying to gain ground on Richard Nixon, who for 8 years had been in the public eye as the man next in command to Ike, the man who had debated the Russian bear Nikita Khrushchev in his own den.
Every word that you have said has been taken down, and I will promise you that every word that you have said here will be reported in the United States, and they will see you say it on television.
Но я видел, я сомневаюсь, поэтому я хочу, чтобы вы...
By the summer of '60, the campaign clock was winding down for both candidates. Kennedy making headway when he impressed Protestant ministers in Houston with his argument that a Catholic could serve both his country and his church without conflict. Nixon having to cope with a remark by his boss, Ike.
One of the issues in this campaign is seeming to turn on the question of Mr. Nixon's experience. And we understand that the power of decision is entirely yours, Mr. President. I just wondered if you could give us an example of a major idea of his that you had adopted in that role as the decider and final...
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember, because...
But Nixon was also hampered by something else, an infected knee that hospitalized him late in the campaign. So it was a tired, ailing Richard Nixon and a vigorous, optimistic John Kennedy who weighed the decision by Congress to suspend broadcasting's so-called equal time rule. Now the networks would not have to give equal time to the 14 minor party candidates running for president in 1960. Now the Democrat could debate the Republican, and millions of Americans would be watching. How many millions? Well, the previous record was 90 million, the number of viewers who saw the Dodgers beat the White Sox in the final game of the 1959 World Series. No one was quite sure just how many people would tune in for the debate. After all, it was an experiment. But everyone was certain the audience could be large enough to make or break careers in politics or broadcasting. CBS was selected to handle the first debate. Today, Studio One here at Channel 2 looks pretty much the way it did then. Even this old boom mic is still here as a reminder of the debate and the days of frantic preparation that preceded it. Because it was the first such debate ever, everyone had a slightly different view of how it should be handled. For CBS, the field commander was Don Hewitt, an energetic young producer-director who would later make an even bigger name for himself as the executive producer of a program called 60 Minutes.
Bill, are our heads equidistant? Or shouldn't Bob be away a little bit? Bob's going to go to his left. Wait a minute, hold.
For days, CBS executives and representatives of both candidates had discussed debate rules, camera positions, lighting, even the style of chairs to be used. A simple gray background was agreed upon, but what kind of paint and what shade? Gallons of it were hand-carried from New York, and the set was repainted again and again until everyone was satisfied. In fact, it was still sticky when the candidates arrived. The candidates were driven to the CBS studios on McClurg Court, not in long lines of black limousines, but in late-model sedans like this 1960 Dodge, maybe in hopes the voters would identify with that. As usual, the Secret Service was nervous, so they drove the cars in a side shipping door into the building itself and then parked them at the end of a long hall just a few steps from the studio itself where the debate would be taking place. Everything was mapped out in advance, as this old diagram prepared by the Secret Service and the Chicago police shows. 2 studios were set aside for the 380 reporters who would be covering the debate. They'd watch it on closed-circuit television. Office space was provided for the candidates and their staffs, and then the studio where the debate itself would be taking place, still marked for Nixon and Kennedy, Howard K. Smith, the moderator, and the 4 reporters who would be questioning the candidates in the debate. Nixon was the first to arrive, his car wheeling into the CBS building about 7:30, an hour before airtime. He was met by a gauntlet of brass from the networks, including CBS Chairman William Paley and President Frank Stanton. Nixon was an old hand at receiving lines, but observers would note that he seemed pale. An aide would confirm that he'd actually turned sheet white after hitting his bad knee getting out of the car. Nixon's arrival in the studio escalated preparations to fever pitch. At this point, Nixon seemed to many to be relaxed, confident. And why not? After all, he was an expert debater. In fact, he had not wanted 4 debates, but just one, presumably so he could knock Kennedy out of the race with a single blow. Finally, he had agreed to the 4-debate series, and now he was ready, bantering easily with cameramen as he waited.
Have you ever had a picture printed yet? God, you're always taking them. I never see them ever print you. You're trying.
Outside the CBS building on McClurg Court, crowds of Kennedy supporters managed to catch only a glimpse of him as his car swept into the back door. As Nixon had done a few minutes earlier, the young Democrat trooped the line of dignitaries. Later, they would remark how good he looked, tanned from a stretch of open-car campaigning in California, tall and graceful in a dark suit, much darker than the medium gray chosen by Nixon, and better fitting, too. Nixon had lost weight during his recent illness, and his clothing seemed baggy by comparison. Kennedy's appearance in the studio drove the photographers wild.
Pull the phones back entirely.
Stay right there. Stay right there, Mr. President. Looking right at the camera here. Do that again. Shake hands again.
Again, Candy, and look this way, please. Gentlemen. Oh, just for over, please. Shake. Okay. Right here.
You had a big crowd in Cleveland.
Finally, Hewitt decided enough was enough. He called a halt, sent the photographers out, and tried to focus the candidates' attention on debate procedures.
Okay, fellas, can we strike this right away, please, and put the other leg turning?
If a question comes from one of the panel, you naturally would want to look at the man asking the question. But when you answer, I will cut to that camera so that the home audience is on the Kennedy camera and the home audience is on the Nixon camera.
Later, it would seem to some as though Nixon's mood had changed after Kennedy's arrival. It seemed as though the appearance of his tall, tanned adversary had caused him to rethink his plan of attack. Not that anyone knew what it was, of course. Driving himself relentlessly as usual, Nixon had spoken to a hostile labor union audience earlier in the day. Later, he'd come back to the Pitt Congress Hotel, cut himself off from all around him, and spent only a few minutes with an advisor going over the debate during the drive to CBS. By contrast, Kennedy had made a brief campaign appearance before the same labor group, then returned to the Ambassador East Hotel to spend most of the day relaxing and role-playing the debate, with advisors firing questions at him on all manner of domestic issues. Ironically, neither candidate could know that what they would say would be overshadowed by how they appeared when they said it. Seemingly minor details such as lighting, makeup, camera shots, those would be what history would remember of the great debate.